The last pew. The last pew on the left side of St. Andrew's Church had belonged to no one for 2 years. No one claimed it. No one wanted it. The people of East Oakland were superstitious in the way that poor people often are. They noticed things, read silences, felt the weight of a room before they walked into it. And something about that corner, something about the shadows that gathered there even on the brightest Sunday mornings, told them to sit somewhere else. Stellan Voss had chosen it for exactly that reason. He arrived before anyone else. Always. He parked 3 blocks away, never closer, never where the black Mercedes could be connected to the man who slipped through the side door before the choir finished warming up. He wore the same dark coat every week. He sat in the same position, spine straight, hands folded, eyes forward, and he looked to anyone who glanced back like a man in prayer. He was not praying. Stellan Voss had stopped praying on the night he watched a car burn on a deserted stretch of road 2 years ago. He had screamed at God that night, cursed him, demanded answers that came back as silence and smoke, and the clinical voice of an investigator telling him that the body inside the vehicle had been identified, that it was over, that he should go home. He had no home to go to after that, only a house. He came to St. Andrew's because Grace had loved it. His daughter, 6 years old, with her dark pigtails and her missing front teeth, and the way she sang along with the choir, even when she didn't know the words, making up syllables that sounded close enough to fool herself. She had sat in the front row, always the front row, her small legs swinging above the floor, her eyes wide and bright, as if every sermon was the most interesting thing she had ever heard. Now Stellan sat in the back where no one could see his face. Today was different from the other Sundays. Today was the second anniversary of the night the car burned. 730 days since he had last heard Grace laugh. 730 mornings of waking up in a house that still smelled faintly of her strawberry shampoo, of walking past a bedroom door he could not bring himself to open, of eating meals he did not taste, prepared by a chef whose name he had to remind himself of each time they crossed paths in the hallway. He had arrived at the church intending to stay for 15 minutes. That was always the plan, 15 minutes, enough to sit where Grace had sat, enough to feel the particular quality of silence that this crumbling building held, and then leave before anyone tried to speak to him. 15 minutes, and then back to the empty house and the glass of whiskey that was already waiting on his desk. He was reaching for his coat, preparing to stand, when the side door opened. She came in, pulling a child by the hand. The woman was young, late 20s, Stellan estimated, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been running on too little sleep for too long. Her coat was thin, inadequate for the December cold, the kind of coat a person buys because it is available and not because it is warm. She scanned the crowded pews with the quick, anxious eyes of someone who already knew she was late and was calculating the cost of it. The child beside her was 6 years old, maybe 7. She wore a dress that had been washed so many times the pattern had gone pale, and her hair was pulled into a ponytail that leaned slightly to the left as if it had been done in a hurry. She clutched a stuffed bear against her chest, a small worn thing with matted fur, and only one eye, the other socket empty, the edges frayed where something had once been sewn. Stellan was looking at the child's shoes. They were pink sneakers, the kind sold in discount bins at the back of thrift stores, already worn by someone else's child before they had found their way to this little girl's feet. They were too small. He could see how her toes pressed against the front of each shoe, distorting the shape. And across the left toe, holding the sole to the upper, was a strip of silver duct tape. The air left Stellan's lungs. 3 years ago, a thrift store on Telegraph Avenue. Grace at his side, her small hand in his, moving through the aisles with the focused attention she brought to everything. She had stopped in front of a display of second-hand shoes, a row of them worn and mismatched and overpriced for what they were, and pointed at a pair of pink sneakers, exactly like the ones he was looking at now. "I like those, Daddy," she had said, and then immediately before he could respond, "But I don't need them." She had smiled up at him with that particular brightness. The smile that meant she had already decided not to want something so that he wouldn't have to tell her no. Grace, who never asked for anything. Grace, who calculated the cost of her own desires against what she imagined he could bear. Stellan's hand, which had been resting on the edge of the pew in preparation to stand, went still. The little girl had broken free from her mother's grip. She walked across the church with a certainty that belonged to someone much older, threading her way between the edges of pews and the shuffling feet of late arrivals, and she stopped in front of Stellan as if she had always known he would be sitting there. She tilted her head slightly, a small, considering angle, the way a child looks at something they are trying to understand, and she met his eyes without flinching. Most people flinched. Grown men flinched. Armed men, dangerous men. Men who had built careers on the ability to hold a steady gaze, they all flinched when they looked directly at Stellan Voss. There was something in his eyes that people recognized on an animal level, something that said, the darkness in this man is real and it is deep, and you do not want to go looking for the bottom of it. This child looked at him the way you look at a window. Is the seat next to you taken, sir? Her voice was barely above a whisper, not from shyness, but from the instinctive quiet of someone who has grown up in small spaces where sound carries. The question was simple. The grammar was careful, the kind of careful that comes from a mother who corrects gently and often. Stellan did not answer. He could not answer because the question had done something to the air in his chest compressed. It made it difficult to move. He looked at the empty space beside him, then back at the child, then at the one-eyed bear she was pressing against her sternum like a shield. Somewhere behind her, he heard the mother's voice low and mortified. Ren, come back here. Don't bother them. Stellan moved his coat. It was nothing. The smallest possible gesture, shifting his coat from the seat beside him, creating a space of 12 inches. He did not nod, did not speak, did not in any measurable way invite the child to sit. He simply removed the obstacle and then looked straight ahead at the altar. The child smiled at him. It was the kind of smile that belongs exclusively to children who have not yet learned to perform happiness for the benefit of others. It was real and immediate and completely unaware of itself, a smile that existed purely because something good had just happened and the face had responded accordingly. It cut through the dim air of the church like light through a crack. She sat down beside him. Her mother arrived 30 seconds later, her face flushed with the particular distress of a parent who has been made to look careless in public. She reached for Ren's arm. She began to apologize to Stellan in a hushed, rapid voice that expected no response. Stellan did not give her one. He was looking at the altar, and he was trying to understand why his legs, which had been fully prepared to carry him out of this building, had entirely refused to cooperate. The child spoke. He's all alone. 3 words, said to her mother, not to him, in the matter-of-fact tone of a child reporting an observable fact. Not a judgment, not a reproach, just a thing she had noticed, named with the same directness she might use to point out a dog across the street or a cloud shaped like a rabbit. Something shifted inside Stellan's chest. Something small, almost imperceptible, like the sound a frozen lake makes when the temperature changes by half a degree. He did not leave. The service continued around them. The choir rose and fell. Father Ellard, the white-haired minister who had run St. Andrew's for 30 years, moved through his sermon with the unhurried authority of a man who has said important things for so long they have become comfortable in his mouth. The congregation stood, sat, knelt, murmured the call and response passages with the ease of long familiarity. Stellan heard none of it. He was aware with a precision that had nothing to do with intention of every movement the child beside him made. The way she sat, still remarkably still for a 6-year-old, her chin resting on the top of the bear's head, her lips moving in what he gradually realized was a private prayer. The way she held the stuffed animal not casually, not as decoration, but with the careful grip of someone guarding something irreplaceable. He listened, and gradually the words of her prayer drifted to him through the church's particular silence. Dear God, it's Ren again. I hope you're not tired of me yet. A pause, she hugged the bear tighter. Please tell Daddy that me and Mommy are okay. Tell him we miss him, but we're being brave like he asked. And please don't let him be cold up there. Daddy always got cold really easy. Mommy used to make him wear 2 sweaters even in October. Stellan's hands folded in his lap tightened. And please help Mommy not be so tired. She works really, really hard. 3 jobs now. I hear her crying sometimes at night when she thinks I'm sleeping. I don't tell her I can hear because I don't want to make her feel bad. The crack in Stellan's chest deepened by another fraction. Also, if it's not too much trouble, could you please help Mr. Buttons find his eye? I know it's a small thing, but he looks sad with just one, and I don't like when my friends are sad. She opened her eyes and she looked at Stellan with the directness that he was already beginning to recognize as simply the way she looked at things. You're praying for someone too, she said. Not a question. Stellan said nothing. That's okay, Ren told him with the gentle certainty of someone delivering a comfort they have themselves received. You don't have to tell me who. The saddest prayers are the ones we keep inside. She turned back to face the altar. Stellan sat with those words for the remainder of the service. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began shuffling toward the exits, the woman Ren's mother gathered her thin coat around her shoulders and reached for her daughter's hand. Say goodbye to the nice man, Ren. Ren looked up at Stellan. Bye, she said. I hope your sad prayer feels better soon. Then she let her mother lead her down the aisle and Stellan watched them go, and he realized that he was still sitting in the pew and the church was nearly empty, and he had, without making any decision to do so, stayed until the very end of the service. In 2 years, he had never done that before. He found them in the churchyard. He had not followed them deliberately. He told himself this, and it was partially true. He had simply taken longer than usual to collect his coat, and the natural path from the side door of the church led through the courtyard, and that was where they were. The mother stood near the steps speaking with Father Ellard, and her body had the posture of someone asking for something they already know. They will not receive the slight forward lean, the hands that could not stay still, the deliberate brightness of expression that is the mask people wear when they are afraid of appearing desperate. Father Ellard was shaking his head gently. Wren stood near the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, Mr. Buttons hanging from one hand, her free hand picking at the bark of the tree with absent attention. She was looking at the sky with the focused interest of someone searching for something specific. And then Stellan heard it, a sound that he recognized before he could name it, the insistent hollow complaint of a stomach that had not been filled in too long, small and mortifying and impossible to suppress. It came from Wren, who immediately pressed her free hand against her midsection and looked around with wide, reddening cheeks to see if anyone had heard. She met Stellan's eyes. I'm not hungry, she told him before he had spoken a word. Her voice was firm in the way of children who have decided on a story and are committed to it. My stomach just makes noises sometimes. Mommy says it's because I talk too much and swallow air. Stellan looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the street corner where an old man sold bread and coffee from a cart every Sunday after the service. He bought a loaf fresh, still warm from the oven, wrapped in paper. He handed the vendor a $50 bill and walked away before change could be offered. He returned to where Wren stood and held out the bread. For me, she said, you're hungry. But I said I wasn't. Your stomach disagreed. The corner of her mouth pulled into something that was almost a smile but was working very hard to stay dignified. She reached out and took the bread from his hands, holding it in both palms, as if weighing it. She looked at it. She looked at him. And then with practiced precision, she tore it directly in half. She held the second piece out to Stellan. He stared at it. What are you doing, sharing? I bought it for you. I know. She pushed the bread toward him with the patient insistence of a child who has explained something obvious and is waiting for the adult to catch up. But Mommy says when someone gives you food, you give some back. Because maybe the person who gave it is hungry too. The people who give things away are usually the ones who need something the most, but don't know how to ask. Stellan did not move. Wren continued without drama in the same quiet and certain voice. Daddy used to share his food with me too. Every time, even when he was really hungry. He said that's what family does. The word landed somewhere behind Stellan's ribs. He took the bread. It was warm against his palm. Such a small and ordinary thing, half a loaf from a street cart handed to him by a child in taped shoes, and it felt heavier than anything he had held in years. He stood in the cold courtyard air and held it and did not eat it and did not understand why he felt for the first time in 730 days that the weight in his hands was something other than grief. He saved it. He did not know why. He wrapped it in a napkin in his coat pocket and he carried it with him. Her name was Nora Calloway. Briggs delivered the information that evening, as Stellan had known he would. 15 years of service had made Briggs extraordinarily good at reading which pieces of information his employer would want without being asked to find them. Nora Calloway, 29 years old, originally from Portland, relocated to Oakland 3 years ago when her husband Owen Calloway took a position at a software company called Meridian Solutions. Daughter Wren, age 6, currently employed in 3 concurrent positions, morning shift at a diner on 14th Street afternoon, cleaning at an office building in downtown Oakland, overnight laundry processing at a hotel near the airport. 6 days a week, 18 hours a day. Resident studio apartment, 300 square feet, Miller Street. 2 months behind on rent. Eviction proceedings had been initiated by the landlord the previous week. Husband deceased. Owen Calloway had died 2 years ago in a single-car collision on Highway 17. He had lost control on a rain-slicked curve gone through a guardrail, and the car had caught fire at the bottom of the embankment. The death had been ruled accidental. The investigation had closed in 72 hours. Stellan read the file twice. Then he told Briggs to find out everything there was to know about Meridian Solutions. He did not explain why. Briggs did not ask. That, too, was part of 15 years. Stellan carried the file up to the second floor of the Oakland Hills mansion, past the doors of rooms he had not entered since Grace disappeared to the third door on the left. He stood with his hand on the knob for a moment, in the way he always did, not hesitating exactly but acknowledging, paying respect to the weight of what was on the other side. He pushed the door open. Grace's room. Everything exactly as she had left it. The canopy bed with its pink princess sheets slightly faded now. The stuffed animals arranged along the pillow in the order of preference that Grace had established and revised and reestablished over the 3 years of her life that had taken place in this room. The coloring book stacked on the small desk still open to the pages she had been working on the last time she sat there. The shoes by the closet, white sneakers with rainbow laces, her favorites chosen by her with great seriousness, from a store where he had told her she could have anything she wanted. She had chosen the least expensive pair. On the nightstand, a photograph in a silver frame. Grace at six-gap-toothed, pigtailed, looking directly at the camera with the particular expression she wore when she was trying to contain delight that was too large for her face to hold. Stellan sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress barely moved beneath him. "I met someone today," he said quietly to the photograph in the way he did every night. "A little girl, about your age." He paused. "She reminded me of you. Not the way she looked, but something else, the way she wasn't afraid of me." He looked at the half loaf of bread still wrapped in its napkin, which he had set on the nightstand beside the frame. "She shared her bread with me. Everything she had, and she gave me half." The room was silent. "She said the people who give things away are the ones who need things most but don't know how to ask." He leaned back against the headboard, still in his coat. Outside, the winter sky had fully darkened. Stars appeared one by one, scattered over Oakland like careless points of light. In a cramped apartment on Miller Street, he imagined a woman was falling asleep on her feet, while a small girl lay in a shared bed talking to a one-eyed bear about whether heaven had good weather this time of year. For the first time in 2 years, Stellan did not reach for the whiskey. He sat in his daughter's room and let himself feel something other than the particular numbness he had cultivated so carefully, and eventually, without deciding to, he fell asleep sitting up against the headboard of a 6-year-old's bed, still holding a napkin-wrapped piece of bread that had been given to him by a child who had nothing to spare. The weeks acquired a shape. Stellan had not had a shape to his weeks in 2 years. He had had schedules, meetings, operations, the relentless machinery of an empire that did not stop simply because its head had lost the will to care about it, but not shape, not the sense of a week having something worth moving toward. Now Sundays had weight. He arrived earlier each week. Not early enough to seem deliberate, simply early enough to ensure that the last pew on the left was available. He placed his coat across the 2 seats beside him, not because he needed the space, but because the coat could be moved when they arrived. When Nora and Ren came through the doors, Ren would see him from across the church, and her face would do the thing it did not, quite a smile, but the preparation for one, the expression that precedes a smile, the way wind precedes rain, and she would pull free from her mother's hand and walk toward him with the settled confidence of someone going somewhere they were always meant to be. "You saved our spots," she said the second Sunday, as if this were established procedure. "I did," Stellan said. "Mr. Buttons says thank you." "You're welcome, Mr. Buttons." Ren looked at the bear and then at Stellan. "He says you're learning." Stellan did not ask what he was learning. He moved his coat and Ren sat down, and her mother arriving behind her with the resigned expression of a woman who has stopped trying to understand certain things took the seat on Ren's other side. "Thank you," Nora said quietly, not elaborating, not explaining what she was thanking him for. Just the 2 words offered with the directness Stellan had already learned was characteristic of her. She said what she meant, only what she meant, and she expected others to meet her at the same level. He nodded. The service began. They did not speak during the sermon. They sat in a row, Nora at the end, Wren in the middle, Stellan at the aisle, and the three of them occupied the same silence in different ways. Nora held her daughter's hand and looked forward with the expression of someone trying to refill something that has been emptied too many times. Wren divided her attention between Father Ellard and the clouds she could see through the high windows, tracking them with the focused interest of a naturalist. Stellan watched them both from the edge of his vision and said nothing, and felt the hairline fractures in his chest quietly multiplying. On the third Sunday, Wren leaned close during a hymn and whispered, "Do you see that cloud?" Stellan looked at the window. "The one that looks like a rabbit," Wren clarified. "Do you see the ears?" He looked more carefully. The cloud was shapeless to him at first, just cloud, just weather. And then something resolved, a longer protrusion here, a rounder mass there, and yes, if you were willing to meet it halfway. "The ears are a bit crooked," he said. Wren made a sound of pure, unguarded delight, a single bright syllable that drew two glances from the row in front of them. She turned to the bear. He saw it, Mr. Buttons. He actually saw it. Nora, on the other side of Wren, pressed her lips together to contain a smile. She did not look at Stellan, but he saw. He learned things about them week by week in the way you learn things about people when the learning happens sideways, not from direct inquiry, but from observation and proximity, and the small declarations that children make without calculating their significance. He learned that Wren's favorite color was yellow, specifically the yellow of early morning light, which she had opinions about distinguishing from midday yellow, which was too sharp. He learned that she wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up, specifically because of Mr. Buttons. "Someone needs to fix animals like him, and I don't want to wait for someone else to do it." He learned that her father Owen had made pancakes shaped like stars on Sunday mornings, and that she missed them more than almost any other single thing, and that Nora tried to replicate them and they came out as blobs, and Wren ate everyone without complaint. He learned that Nora never volunteered information about herself, but that she listened to everything, and that she remembered everything she heard, and that she was beneath the exhaustion and the weariness, formidably intelligent and quietly furious at the world, in a way she kept carefully contained. He did not learn this from anything she said. He learned it from the way she held herself, the particular stillness of a person who has decided that visible anger is a luxury they cannot afford. On a Tuesday morning, Briggs called. "I have something you need to see, boss." The footage was 37 seconds long. It had been recorded by Briggs from a surveillance position across the street from Lincoln Elementary, where a pattern of concerning behavior had been flagged by one of the watchers Stellan had quietly positioned near the school. Stellan watched it once. Then he watched it again. Three boys older, larger, the particular species of cruelty that grows in institutional neglect, had surrounded Wren in the schoolyard. The tallest one, a boy named Colt with a broad build and small eyes, had reached for Mr. Buttons. Wren had pulled back. He had pulled harder. And then the bear had sailed through the air in a lazy arc and landed in a puddle of standing water near the chain-link fence. Wren had run for the bear, dropped to her knees in the wet concrete, and come up holding the soaked and muddied thing to her chest. Then Colt had kicked her casually, almost as afterthought, and she had fallen forward, catching herself on her palms, her knees hitting the ground. She had not cried. She had sat in the dirt for a moment, and then she had gotten up. A teacher standing near the building's entrance had watched the entire thing without moving. When Wren got to her feet, the teacher said something and went inside. Stellan set the phone down on his desk. He sat very still for a long time. He thought about it carefully. The boy's father worked in manufacturing. The manufacturing company held 3 major contracts. One of those contracts was maintained by a logistics firm that Stellan happened to have influence over. A phone call was made not to anyone directly involved, but to the right person who spoke to the right other person who mentioned that an attractive relocation package had materialized for anyone willing to take a position at their Phoenix facility. The family relocated within the week. Colt never returned to Lincoln Elementary. The following Sunday, Wren arrived with Mr. Buttons clean and dry under her arm, and she said nothing about the schoolyard, and neither did he, and the bruises on her forearms were fading, and that was enough. But the schoolyard incident had set Briggs digging in a direction Stellan had already been watching. The Meridian Solutions thread had been unspooling for 11 days, and what it was revealing had begun to pull at something in Stellan's chest that felt very different from the particular weight of grief he had grown accustomed to carrying. Meridian Solutions, a software company mid-sized based in Oakland. Owen Calloway had been employed there as a senior engineer for 18 months before his death. Standard employment record, no disciplinary issues, strong performance reviews. Except 3 days before the accident on Highway 17, Owen Calloway had sent an encrypted email to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI's San Francisco field office. The email contained documentation spreadsheets, transaction records, internal communications. Owen had, in the course of his ordinary work, stumbled onto something that did not belong in the kind of company Meridian Solutions claimed to be. Cash flows that did not correspond to any legitimate business activity. Accounts that existed only to receive and immediately reroute funds. Layers of financial architecture designed by someone who knew exactly how to make money disappear. Owen had done what an honest man would do. He had gathered the evidence and contacted the federal authorities and waited to hear back. He had died before they responded. The FBI email had been flagged routed and placed in a queue for follow-up that never came. Meridian Solutions declared bankruptcy and dissolved its corporate structure within 72 hours of Owen's death. The money vanished. The records vanished. The case was marked inactive. Briggs had kept pulling at the thread. Meridian Solutions was a subsidiary. Its parent company, a holding entity registered in Delaware with an address that corresponded to a mail forwarding service, was called Harrow Capital Group. Harrow Capital Group had been active for 8 years and had been dissolved 14 months ago. Its officers were listed as a series of names that did not correspond to real people, except for one financial consultant whose signature appeared on 3 years' worth of documents. A name listed as the primary architect of the company's capital structure, Isabel Crane. Stellan read the name 3 times. The report included a photographed standard corporate headshot, blonde hair, professional, smile taken approximately 5 years ago during the period she had been consulting for Harrow Capital Group, the period of their marriage. Stellan sat in the underground office for a very long time without moving. He had known from the beginning that Isabel had been selling information to his rivals. Had known about the offshore accounts, the slow, methodical theft, the long game she had been playing beneath the surface of their marriage, with a patience that he still found even now almost admirable in its precision. He had known the divorce was her attempt to extract maximum value before the wreckage became obvious. He had not known about Owen Calloway. He had not known that the same woman who had taken Grace from her bed in the middle of the night, who had staged a burning car and a falsified death, in 2 years of grief that had turned him into something that no longer resembled a human being, that same woman had also ordered the death of a man named Owen Calloway. An honest man, a software engineer who had found something he wasn't supposed to find and had tried to do the right thing about it. The father of a 6-year-old girl named Wren, who wore taped shoes, who shared her bread, who sat beside him every Sunday morning and asked if he could see the rabbit in the clouds. Stellan closed the folder. The room felt different now, smaller and larger. At the same time, the walls, both closer and further away, the air rearranged. He sat with the understanding for a long time, letting it settle, letting it become real rather than just information. Then he opened his phone and called Briggs. Round-the-clock surveillance on Nora and Wren Calloway. Completely invisible, they noticed nothing. He paused. And everything there is to know about Isabel's current location and operations. Everything. Another pause. And Brig, nobody touches those two. Not the landlord, not anyone. As of right now, Nora and Wren Calloway are under my protection. He hung up and looked at the face-down photograph of Isabel on his desk. Nora found the box on her doorstep the following Sunday, a star-shaped pancake mold and a bag of premium pancake mix. No note, no explanation. She stood in the doorway of their apartment, holding it for a long moment, and then she carried it inside and did not ask questions because she had already noticed enough to suspect, and some gifts were better received without the weight of an accounting. On the 5th Sunday, Wren arrived with a piece of paper folded into careful quarters clutched in her fist with the seriousness of someone carrying something fragile. I made you something, she announced, sliding into the seat beside him. I worked on it every day this week. She held out the folded paper. Stellan opened it slowly. The drawing was a child's work in every technical sense. The proportions imprecise, the perspective purely conceptual, the colors applied with the enthusiastic disregard for boundaries that belongs to small hands and fat crayons. But the image was legible. 2 figures stood on a cloud rendered in white and pale blue. The taller figure wore black. The smaller one wore pink with a circle of yellow above her head. They were holding hands. At the bottom, in careful, slightly uneven letters, Mr. Stellan and Grace, best friends in heaven. I know Grace is in heaven with my daddy, Ren said, watching his face with the attentiveness of someone who has learned to read expressions as a form of self-protection. So I thought maybe they're friends up there, and maybe you could have this so you can see them being happy. So you don't have to feel so sad when you think about her. Stellan looked at the drawing. He was aware with a distant and almost academic clarity that something was happening in his face that he had not planned for and could not stop. His vision had changed. The drawing had gone slightly imprecise at the edges, which was a physical phenomenon with only one explanation, and it was not one he had experienced in 2 years, and he had not thought himself capable of it anymore. Across the aisle, Briggs had stopped lifting his coffee cup and was holding it motionless halfway between the pew and his mouth, looking at his employer with an expression that no one who worked for Stellan Voss had ever worn before. "It's perfect," Stellan said. His voice came out differently than usual. Rougher, less controlled. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given me." Ren's face broke open into sunlight. She leaned very naturally against his arm, a small shift of weight, unself-conscious the way children lean against things that feel solid. Stellan sat completely still. The drawing in his hands, the child's shoulder warm against his sleeve, and he let it happen. On the other side of Ren, Nora Calloway had gone very quiet. She was looking straight ahead at the altar, but her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright, and she was doing the things she did when something had reached past her defenses, and she needed a moment to rebuild them. Father Ellard's voice rose toward the morning light. Outside, December clouds moved steadily over Oakland, and if you looked at them long enough and were willing to meet them halfway, you could find almost any shape in them that you were looking for. The call came on a Thursday night, and it changed the shape of everything. Briggs had been working the Meridian Solutions thread for 11 days of financial records and corporate registrations, and the particular kind of forensic accounting that required patience above all else. He came into the underground office at 9:17 in the evening and set a single folder on the desk without preamble. "Sit down, boss." Stellan looked at him. In 15 years, Briggs had never told him to sit down. The instruction was so outside the established register of their relationship that Stellan felt its weight before he understood its content. He sat. Briggs opened the folder. "The body in the car," he said, "2 years ago." He paused for exactly 1 second. It wasn't Grace. The words entered the room and hung there suspended the way smoke hangs in still air. Stellan heard them. He processed their grammatical structure. He understood in a purely mechanical sense what they meant. And then he sat with them for a long and terrible moment while the implications assembled themselves slowly one after another like a structure being built in the dark. The original medical examiner who signed the death certificate and filed the DNA findings, his name is Arthur Pell. He retired 14 months ago, bought a house in Sedona, cash purchase. The price was $212,000. Stellan did not move. "I found him 3 days ago. It took 40 minutes and a significant amount of money to get him talking." Briggs turned a page in the folder. The DNA results were falsified. The body recovered from the vehicle was not Grace. It was a child female, approximately 6 years old, sourced through a network Isabel Crane was connected to. The air in the underground office had changed its quality entirely. "Grace is alive." Briggs said it directly without cushioning because there was no way to cushion it, and both of them knew it. "She's being held at a private estate in the Bitterroot Valley, Southwest Montana. Remote location, single access road, heavy tree cover. Isabel acquired the property through a trust 18 months ago. Prior to that, Grace was held at 2 other locations, one in Nevada and one in Idaho. She's been moved twice, each time Isabel detected any proximity of investigation." Stellan stood. He was not aware of standing. He was simply on his feet, and then he was at the far wall of the office, and he could not reconstruct the sequence of events between the chair and the wall. His hands were pressed flat against the cold concrete. He was breathing, he was certain he was breathing, but the mechanism of it had become unfamiliar, something he was having to manage manually. 2 years. Grace had been alive for 2 years, alive and alone in a succession of remote locations while he had sat in her room every night talking to a photograph, while he had drunk himself to the edge of consciousness, while he had sat in the last pew of a church and let a child with taped shoes slowly defrost the thing inside his chest. that had frozen solid the night he watched a car burn. His daughter had been watching the seasons change through a barred window in Montana. Stellan's hands pressed against the wall, curled slowly into fists. The desk behind him met his fist with a crack that resonated through the concrete walls and left a fracture running from the front right corner to the center. Briggs stood very still. Stellan looked at his hand. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and covered his face with both hands, and for the first time since Grace had disappeared, he did not care who was watching. Briggs sat down on the floor across from him and said nothing and waited. And this was perhaps the finest thing he had ever done in 15 years of service. It took approximately 4 minutes. Then Stellan lowered his hands. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time. But beneath it, or perhaps through it, something else had emerged, something cold and purposeful and extremely dangerous. "How many men does she have at the Montana property?" he said. "Rotating shifts, 8 to 12 at any given time. Former military, 2 of them, the rest are contracted." Briggs had clearly been preparing for this conversation. The estate is 40 acres. Perimeter fencing, motion sensors, 2 dogs. Based on utility usage patterns and delivery records, Grace is most likely in the upper east quadrant of the building. "Who else knows she's alive?" "As far as I can determine, only Isabel and the people she pays." "There's more," Briggs said. "Isabel called while I was driving here. She left a voicemail on the secured line. She said she knows you've been asking questions. She said you have 72 hours to stop, and she left a number." Stellan's jaw tightened. She's been watching the investigation. He called the number from the underground office. Briggs present, the call recorded. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, warm and precise, and underneath both of those things, completely without mercy. "I wondered how long it would take you," Isabel said. "Where is she?" "She's fine. Better than fine, actually. I've been generous. She has books, outdoor time when weather permits, regular meals." A pause. "She asks about you, every few weeks. I always tell her the same thing, that you're very busy. She seems to accept it. Children are remarkably adaptable." The temperature in the underground office dropped several degrees. "Here is what I'm offering," Isabel continued in the tone of someone presenting a business proposal they consider more than fair. $100 million wired to an account I'll provide within 48 hours of agreement. In exchange, I will give you a location and a confirmation that Grace is exactly where I say she is, unharmed and available for collection." Stellan said nothing. "There is one additional condition." He waited. "The Calloway woman, her daughter." Isabel's voice did not change. "You will end all contact, all protection. You will remove every resource you've placed in proximity to their lives. They go back to being what they were before you noticed them, invisible, struggling, nobody's concern. You will not speak to them, watch over them, or intervene in their affairs in any way for the rest of their lives. You have 72 hours to agree," Isabel said. "After that, my terms change, and you will not prefer the new terms." The call ended. Briggs waited on the other side of the room. "She knew about Nora and Ren," Stellan said finally. "She's been watching you for some time." Stellan looked at the far wall. He thought about Ren pressing her half of the bread toward him with patient insistence. He thought about Nora's voice, only what she meant and nothing more, and the way she had looked at him the morning of the hospital bill, searching his face for the cost of the kindness. "Briggs," he said, "yes. I want you to go to Montana." He spoke slowly, precisely. "Take whoever you need. I want Grace extracted safely, not quickly, safely. That is the only priority. Plan it properly, surveil the property for as long as necessary, and do not move until you are certain." Briggs nodded. "I'll stay here. Isabel is watching. If I disappear, she'll know something is happening, and she'll move Grace again." He paused. "And Nora and Ren will be within reach while I'm gone. I will not leave them unprotected." Briggs stood, understood. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "She has no idea Grace is alive. She still thinks you're operating on 2-year-old information." Stellan looked at him. "That," Briggs said, "is the only advantage we have. Nora Calloway found out on a Sunday. Not everything, not yet, but enough to change the architecture of the world she had been carefully constructing for 2 years. She had gone back to the church for her scarf, left it on the pew during the service, remembered it halfway down the block. She came in through the side door and moved down the side aisle toward the back. She heard voices before she reached the courtyard exit, two men outside near the black Mercedes. One of Briggs's jackets shifted as he reached into the vehicle for something, and Nora Calloway, who had grown up in a house where her father's gun had occupied a specific drawer and its outline had been part of the visual vocabulary of her childhood, recognized immediately what she was looking at. That was not a security guard's weapon. She walked backwards slowly into the shadow of the doorway, and then she turned and went out the way she came. She did not retrieve her scarf. That evening after Wren was asleep, Nora sat at the cardboard box desk with her laptop open. She typed the name into the search bar, and she was not naive about what she might find. What she found was thorough. Not criminal records, those she understood did not exist for men like Stellan Voss, because men like Stellan Voss did not have criminal records in the way that ordinary criminals did. What she found was more oblique business entities that dissolved without explanation, journalists who had investigated him and then written nothing, a civil lawsuit filed, and then withdrawn within a week. She found one article from a business magazine 6 years ago that described Voss Capital Group in terms that became carefully neutral whenever the conversation approached questions of capital origin. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark of the apartment, and she listened to Wren breathing, and she thought about 7 weeks of Sundays in a hospital room at 4:30 in the morning and a box of pancake supplies left on their doorstep without a note. She thought about the gun on Briggs's hip. Then she called Fergus Mallory. She and Fergus had not spoken since Owen's funeral. He had been Owen's college roommate, the best man at their wedding. He answered on the third ring, his voice surprised and wary in equal measure. "I need you to look into someone for being," she said. "His name is Stellan Voss." A silence that was longer than it should have been. "Where did you meet this man, Nora?" His voice had changed, quieter, more careful. "He goes to my church." "Can you meet me tomorrow, not over the phone?" "The coffee shop on Broadway. 11 in the morning." Fergus arrived looking like he had not slept and slid a manila folder across the table before she had finished sitting down. He told her methodically, without drama, the way good journalists present things they find genuinely troubling. The organizational structure that law enforcement had been attempting to document for years without success. Witnesses who had cooperated with investigations and then declined to testify. A federal case that had been 3 weeks from indictment when the lead prosecutor's star witness relocated overseas. The specific geography of how power operated in Oakland's underground economy and where Stellan Voss sat within that geography. Nora listened to all of it. She turned the pages of the folder one by one. She looked at the documents, the redacted reports, the photograph of Stellan at a fundraising gala 8 years ago. Younger. Harder, the expensive suit doing very little to soften what was underneath. She closed the folder. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate you coming." She walked out of the coffee shop and stood on the sidewalk in the December cold for a long moment. Then she went to pick up Wren from Mrs. Alderman's apartment and went home. And while Wren drew at her cardboard box desk, Nora opened their worn suitcase and began placing things inside it. Methodically, practically, one decision at a time. She took Wren's spare dress, her socks, her toothbrush. She took the documents from the folder under the mattress. Social Security cards, birth certificate, the paperwork assembled in the first weeks after Owen died. She took the photograph of Owen from the nightstand, wrapped it in a sweater, placed it on top. She was reaching for Wren's school shoes when Wren spoke. "Mommy?" Nora turned. Wren stood in the middle of the room in her nightgown, one fist pressed against her chest, Mr. Buttons in the other hand. Her eyes moved from the suitcase to her mother's face and back again with the comprehensive attention of a child who has learned to read rooms as a matter of survival. "Why are you packing, Ma? We're going to visit someone, baby." The lie was thin, and they both knew it. In the middle of the night, Nora set down the shoe. She knelt so her face was level with Wren's. She tried to find the words that were honest without being the wrong kind of honest. "I just think it might be time to try somewhere new," she said. "A new place, a new adventure." Wren looked at her for a long moment. "Because of Mr. Stellan." Nora's breath caught. "He's not bad, Mommy." Wren's voice was quiet and completely certain. "He's sad. That's different from bad. He's sad like I'm sad when I miss Daddy. He's sad like the hole inside. He needs us. He needs me." She paused. "And I need him too." Nora closed her eyes. The knock at the door came 10 minutes later. She took the kitchen knife from the counter. She positioned herself between the door and Ren, and she felt the familiar, terrible clarity of a person who has reduced everything to a single priority. Nora, his voice through the door, flat and quiet. I know you found out. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me explain once. After that, if you want to leave, I won't stop you. Ren looked at the door. Nora looked at her daughter. Then she opened it. Stellan stood in the hallway without his coat, which she had never seen. And without it, he looked somehow more present, more three-dimensional, more there. He looked at the knife in her hand without surprise, and at Ren behind her, and then back at Nora. Okay, Nora said. Talk. They sat at the small table. Ren sat on the bed with Mr. Buttons close enough to hear everything, and Nora did not send her away because Ren would hear it eventually, and there was something to be said for not requiring a child to learn the same truth twice. Stellan talked for a long time. He told her about Isabel, the marriage, the betrayal, the slow and methodical theft that had been happening beneath the surface of everything he believed was real. He told her about Grace's disappearance, the ransom, the burning car, the falsified death certificate. He told her about 2 years of grief and whiskey and the last pew on the left and 100 Sundays of sitting alone in the dark of a building that held the last good memory he had. Nora listened without interrupting. Then Stellan looked at the table and he told her about Owen. He did not approach it gradually. He had thought on the drive here about how to say it, and he had concluded that there was no kind way, and that kindness in this context was less important than truth. Your husband discovered Isabel's money laundering operation, he said, through his work at Meridian Solutions. He compiled evidence and contacted the FBI. Nora had gone completely still. 3 days before he was scheduled to meet with their financial crimes division, Isabel had him killed. The car accident was arranged. Brake lines, the rain, the curve, all of it was deliberate. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of something clicking into place, the sound a key makes in a lock that has been waiting for it for 2 years. The insurance claim, she said finally, they denied it. Suspicious circumstances. They were told to deny it. He knew. Her voice was strange, low, and slightly distant. Owen knew something was wrong at that company. He told me something felt off 3 weeks before I told him to be careful, and he said he would be, and then he was just, she stopped, breathed. He was doing the right thing. He was. He was just trying to do the right thing. I know. What happened next was something Stellan had not predicted. Nora Calloway stood up, and she walked around the table to where he sat, and she hit him. Not with the knife had been set down somewhere during the conversation without either of them marking the moment. She hit him with her hands, both fists striking his chest and his shoulder with the mechanical rhythm of someone whose body has overridden its instructions and is operating on an older protocol, something below language and decision. Stellan did not move, did not block, did not stand, did not in any way attempt to reduce or deflect what was happening. He sat in the chair and he took it because the only honest response to the grief of another person when you have had a hand in its cause, even if only at several removes, is to be present for it. Nora's fist slowed, then stopped. She stood with her hands pressed flat against his chest, her forehead dropped forward, her breath coming in long and difficult waves. She was not crying. Nora Calloway cried in private or not at all. My husband was killed, she said, because he tried to do the right thing. Yes, she lifted her head. Her eyes were dry and absolutely direct. What are you going to do about it? It was the most Nora Calloway thing she had ever said to him. Not how could this happen? Not why didn't someone stop it? Not any of the questions that pointed backward toward the unchangeable. She was looking at him and asking only what was actionable. Everything, Stellan said. She held his gaze for a long moment, measuring the word, testing it against everything she knew and everything she suspected. Then she stepped back. Then I'm not leaving, she said. She turned toward Ren, who was sitting on the bed watching them both with ancient eyes. We're not leaving. Ren looked at Stellan over her mother's shoulder. I told you, she said with the peaceful certainty of someone whose prediction has come true. 3 days later, Briggs left for Montana. The planning had been careful. 11 days of surveillance imagery, 3 independent assessments of the security rotation, 2 exit routes identified and confirmed passable, a medical team positioned in Billings in the event that Grace required immediate attention. Stellan had reviewed every element twice. I want you to go, Stellan said the night before departure. Take whoever you need. I want Grace extracted safely. That is the only priority. After Briggs left, Stellan went to Grace's room and sat on the edge of the bed for the last time before things changed. I know where you are, he said quietly to the photograph on the nightstand, and I'm sending the best person I trust to bring you home. When you get here, he paused. He looked at Ren's drawing pinned carefully to the wall above the nightstand, two figures on a cloud holding hands, yellow halo and dark coat. There's someone I want you to meet. Two people, actually. I think you're going to like them. Briggs called 41 hours later. Stellan was standing in the kitchen of the mansion when the phone rang. We're in, Briggs said. Third floor east side. We've cleared the ground floor. 2 minutes. Stellan stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden and did not move and did not breathe in any functional sense. Then Briggs's voice again. We found her. And then before Stellan could speak, the sound of a phone being transferred in a voice. 8 years old. Thin and cautious and careful in a way that no 8-year-old should need to be careful. But unmistakably completely beyond any possibility of doubt. Daddy? The word did to Stellan Voss what 2 years of grief had not been able to do, what a burning car and a falsified death certificate and 730 nights of whiskey and silence had not managed. It went directly through every defense he had ever constructed and arrived at something underneath all of them, something that had been waiting in the dark for precisely this. Grace. He pressed his palm flat against the window glass as if the solidity of it could help him stay upright. Grace, it's Daddy. I'm here. I waited for you every day. Her voice was very small. They told me you forgot about me. They said you didn't want me anymore. But I didn't believe them. I knew you would come. I never forgot you, not for 1 second, not ever. I want to come home, Daddy. I want to come home. You're coming home, sweetheart. Briggs is going to bring you to me. You're safe now. I promise you you're safe. Will you stay on the phone? I'm not going anywhere. He stood at the kitchen window with his hand against the glass and Grace's voice in his ear, and he wept openly in a room with no one watching, and it was the first time in 2 years that his tears were not purely the product of loss. The second phone vibrated against the counter, Nora's name on the screen. He stared at it for one suspended moment, Grace's voice still in his ear. Nora's name on the screen and the particular quality of dread that arrives when you understand that two things you have been holding simultaneously are about to collide. Grace, sweetheart, I need to make one more call. I'm going to hand you back to Briggs. He's going to stay with you the whole way home. I'll see you soon. I love you. I love you too, Daddy. He switched calls. Nora's voice was stripped of everything except the essential. Ren is gone. Someone took her from school. A woman she had authorization paperwork, they let her walk out with her. Stellan, she's gone. Isabel had lost Grace, and she had moved immediately and without hesitation to the contingency she had prepared for exactly this eventuality. Ren Calloway did not cry. She had decided this in the first 30 seconds, while the woman's arms were still around her and the school entrance was disappearing behind the van's tinted rear window. Crying was what they wanted. She understood this the way she understood most things, not from instruction, but from observation, from 7 weeks of sitting beside a man who had taught her without meaning to, that the most dangerous thing you could give another person was exactly what they were trying to take from you. She sat in the back of the van with her wrists bound in front of her, and she breathed slowly and she looked at everything. The van had 4 windows, 2 on the sides, small, and tinted, 1 in the rear door, and a partition of metal mesh separating the cargo area from the 2 front seats. Through the side windows, she could see the city moving past. She knew Oakland well enough from the bus routes she and her mother traveled. Every week, the shapes of the highway overpasses the particular colors of the warehouse districts near the port, the way the light changed when you moved from the residential streets toward the water. She was being taken south. The woman in the passenger seat was on the phone. Ren listened without appearing to listen. She caught fragments. Montana. Already gone. It doesn't matter, we have the girl, and then lower heel deal. Ren filed this away. Mr. Buttons was still in her arms. They had not taken him, which told her something about how much they had planned for a 6-year-old's resistance. She held him with both zip-tied hands and pressed her face briefly against his worn fur, not from fear, but from the particular comfort of something familiar in a situation that was not. Stellan had told her things, Several Sundays ago in the courtyard after the service with the seriousness of an adult speaking to another adult. If anyone you don't know tries to take you somewhere, scream and run, get to a teacher, get to your mother, get to anyone you trust. If you can't run, remember everything you see. Every sign, every turn, every detail. Details are how people get found. She had screamed. She had tried to run. They had been faster. So now she was doing the second thing. The van merged onto the highway. Through the right side window, she could see the elevated structure of 880 moving alongside them, the blue-green of its support columns, the numbered mile markers that appeared at regular intervals along the shoulder. She watched them, counted them. They passed marker 44, then 45, then 46. She looked at the window. The seal around its edge was not perfect, a slight deformation where the rubber gasket had shrunk or compressed over time, leaving a gap of perhaps half an inch between the glass and the frame. Not large enough for a hand, but large enough for something smaller. She looked at Mr. Buttons. He had one eye. His fur was worn thin in the places she held him most often. He smelled like her coat pocket and like the particular detergent her mother bought because it was the cheapest brand at the corner store, and like underneath both of those things, something that had no name but meant safe. She pressed her face against him one more time. Then with the focused deliberateness of someone making a decision they intend to honor, she worked her bound hands toward the gap in the window seal. The van passed marker 47. Mr. Buttons dropped. She felt him leave her hands, a small, soft weight gone between one heartbeat and the next. She did not watch him fall. She turned back to the front and arranged her face into the expression that adults expected from frightened children, and she sat with her empty hands and the particular hollowness of having given away something precious on purpose. "Help them find me," she had told him silently in the half-second before she let go. She looked at the window and memorized the mile marker. 47. Nora Calloway was already moving. She had not waited for Stellan to tell her what to do. She had ended the call to him the moment she understood that he was processing two crises simultaneously, Grace on one line, Ren on the other, and she had made the calculation that a man trying to hold on to his daughter after 2 years of believing she was dead could not also be the person she needed him to be right now. She went to the school first. The receptionist sat at her desk with the shell-shocked expression of someone who has just understood the dimensions of a mistake. The authorization paperwork was still on the counter, a forged letter, professional quality, with a phone number for confirmation. Nora picked it up and looked at it with the cold attention of a woman who has nothing left to lose by being thorough. "The woman who came for my daughter," she said. "Describe her." The receptionist described her. The vehicle. The security guard on the front entrance had seen it. Dark panel van, commercial plates, no identifying markings. He had written down 2 digits. Nora looked at the 2 digits. She thought about the direction the van had turned when it left the school parking lot. She thought about what was south of Lincoln Elementary, the geography of Oakland. She had learned through 2 years of bus routes and walking commutes in the particular intimate knowledge of a city that you acquire when you cannot afford to travel it any other way. The port. She did not know why she was certain. She was certain nonetheless. She called Stellan from the sidewalk outside the school, walking fast. "Dark van," she said when he answered. "Partial plate ends in 7 Tango 4. They went south on 8-8. I think they're heading toward the port." She stopped at the corner. The guard saw them turn left. Everything left of the school on that block feeds to 880 southbound. And Isabel is a woman who plans. She'd want water access, exit options. The port has both. She heard him processing. "Briggs," he said, not to her, to someone in the background. 880 southbound, partial plate, 7 Tango 4 dark commercial van. Pull every camera feed from marker 40 to the port. Now." Then back to her, "Nora, go home." "No, it isn't. She's my daughter," Nora said. The words came out very quietly, which was more final than shouting would have been. "Tell me where to go." A pause, then, "Stay on the phone." She stayed on the phone. Before driving to the port, Stellan had made 2 calls. The first was to the operative who had flown with Grace from Montana, a woman named Carver, former Army medic, who now sat with Grace in a safe house in the hills while the rest of this played out. The second was to Briggs, who had handed Grace off to Carver at Oakland International 40 minutes earlier and was already moving south on 880 when Stellan reached him. Briggs found Mr. Buttons at mile marker 47. One of the surveillance teams had been working the highway camera feeds in real time. A maintenance camera mounted on an overpass had captured something small and soft lying on the asphalt. A stuffed bear, one-eye worn fur, lying on its side on the shoulder of 880 with the particular stillness of something that had been placed there rather than lost. "She left us a trail," Briggs said into the phone, and Stellan heard him, and the sound that came back through the line was something Briggs had never heard from his employer before and would not forget. The van had gone to the port, specifically to the cluster of decommissioned storage facilities in the southwestern corner of the complex, a maze of corrugated metal warehouses and empty container yards that the Port Authority managed with benign neglect. The buildings had been empty for 3 years. They were not surveilled. They were not patrolled. They were dark and cold and private, and they were exactly the kind of place that Isabel Crane had been identifying for years as contingencies. She was always 3 moves ahead, except she did not know that the moves had already changed. Inside the largest warehouse at its center, a single work lamp on a stand cast harsh light across a circle of concrete floor. Within that circle, a metal chair. And in the chair, wrist-bound ankles, secured to the chair legs, a small figure in a faded dress who was sitting with a stillness that Stellan recognized immediately as deliberate. Wren was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid because she was 6 years old, and she had been taken from her school by a stranger and driven to a warehouse by the water, and that was objectively terrifying. But she had made the decision not to let the fear run her, and she was honoring it with every line of her small body. Behind her, with one hand resting on the back of the chair and the other holding a gun, with the ease of someone for whom it was a familiar object, stood Isabel Crane. She looked exactly as she had in every photograph. The blonde hair, the professional, bearing the particular quality of composure that belonged to a certain kind of intelligence. The kind that had always won, that had spent so long winning that it had confused its own competence for invincibility. But in the set of her jaw, in the slight tightness around her eyes, Stellan could see something he had not expected. She was afraid too, not of him, of what it meant that Grace was gone. In all the years he had known her, Isabel had operated from the certainty of control, and now that certainty had developed its first real fracture. She had loved Grace once, or something close to love, the version of it available to a person who had never been taught the real thing. She had watched Grace grow for the first 3 years of the child's life, and had felt occasionally something that was not strategy. It was the only fact about herself that she still found inconvenient, and it was written faintly but legibly across her face in this moment. She looked at Stellan as he stepped into the circle of light. "There he is," she said. Her voice was the same, warm and precise, and underneath both of those things completely without mercy. "Let her go," Stellan said. "Not until we've had a conversation." "We've had our conversation." That was a phone call. Isabel tilted her head, a gesture he remembered from the years of their marriage. "This is the part where you understand that I am still in control of how this ends." Stellan said nothing. He stood in the light and he looked at Wren, who was looking back at him with an expression he could not immediately classify. Not fear, not relief, not the particular pleading look of a child waiting to be rescued. Something more deliberate than any of those things. "Grace is gone," Isabel continued. "I know that already. My people in Montana confirmed it 2 hours ago. You moved faster than I anticipated. I'll accept that." She said it with the flat tone of someone adjusting a business projection. "But that changes nothing fundamental about your situation. You are standing here because I allowed you to, because I know you well enough to know that you came alone, and I know you well enough to know that you won't move while I'm holding this child. Put the gun down, Isabel. When we've reached an agreement, there is no agreement, then she stays in that chair." Her hand tightened slightly on the weapon. "I want what I asked for, the money and the Calloway woman and her daughter out of your life permanently. Grace is gone. Yes, that's unfortunate, but I can disappear and you will never find me again. You know that's true." Stellan looked at her. "Yes," he said. "You did." Something moved in Wren's face. She had been listening to every word with the focused attention of a child who has learned that adults say their most important things when they believe no one small is paying attention. She had been listening and thinking and assembling, And now she looked at Isabel Crane with an expression that was remarkably, impossibly, something close to pity. "You're sad," Wren said. Her voice was hoarse from the cold and from the hours of silence she had maintained since the van, but it was steady, completely steady. Isabel looked at her. Something shifted in her composure, barely visible, the first weather of an approaching change. "You're sad," Wren said again. "That's why you do bad things. My daddy told me the people who hurt others usually just never learned how to be loved. They hurt because they're hurting inside." "Be quiet," Isabel said. The instruction had no edge of anger in it. That was the thing, it was not anger that Isabel was suppressing. What was happening in her face was something different, something that Stellan recognized as something far more disorienting. She was being seen, not assessed, not evaluated, not processed as a variable in someone's strategic calculation. Seen in the way that only certain people can see other people, with genuine attention, without agenda, with the particular quality of recognition that a child offers when she has not yet learned to perform indifference to the suffering of others. "I'm sorry no one taught you," Wren said softly. "That must be really lonely." "Grace is already safe," Wren continued, her voice steady and calm. "I heard Mr. Stellan on the phone. He was crying happy tears. He said she was coming home." She held Isabel's gaze without flinching. "You already lost. And now you're standing here with a gun, and I don't think you even know what you're trying to win anymore." The gun trembled. It was almost imperceptible, a small, involuntary movement in the hand, the kind of tremor that comes not from physical weakness, but from a sudden disruption in the internal architecture that has been holding everything steady. Isabel had built her entire operational life on the premise that she was not subject to the same vulnerabilities as other people, that the part of the human psyche that could be reached by simple things, by kindness, by being seen, by the artless honesty of a child who had nothing to protect, had been removed from her or had never existed. A 6-year-old girl in a faded dress sitting in a metal chair in a warehouse by the water had just proven that premise wrong. And in the half-second that followed, in the specific window created by a woman whose absolute certainty had just developed its first crack, Briggs came through the east entrance. He moved without announcement, without drama, with the comprehensive efficiency of someone who had done this before and had no interest in the theatrical dimensions of the moment. His arm went around Isabel from behind, locking hers to her side. His other hand controlled the weapon with a single practiced movement that had the gun on the floor before the sound of his footsteps had fully registered. Isabel Crane went down to her knees on the concrete. She did not struggle. She knelt with the weapon gone and the game finished, and a 6-year-old girl watching her from a metal chair, and she looked at the floor and she was quiet. Stellan was already running, not the measured, controlled movement of a man managing a tactical situation. Running open and urgent, and completely without calculation, the running of a father who has covered the last 15 feet between himself and a child he has been trying to protect for weeks and has almost failed to protect and has not failed. She is right here, she is right in front of him. He dropped to his knees in front of the chair. He worked at the zip ties with hands that were not entirely steady, and they came apart in the rope around her ankles, and then Wren Calloway launched herself out of the chase with the full committed force of a 6-year-old who has been holding very still for a very long time and is no longer required to. Her arms went around his neck. Her legs wrapped around his waist. She buried her face against his shoulder, and for a moment Stellan Voss simply held a small girl in a cold warehouse and felt the whole architecture of the last 2 years shift and resettle around this single fixed point. "I knew you'd come," she said into his shoulder. Her voice was muffled and slightly unsteady, and still underneath everything certain. "You promised." "I'm here." He held her tighter. "I'm here. You're safe." "I wasn't scared." A pause. "Okay, I was a little scared, but I remembered what you said. I screamed, I tried to run. They were faster." She pulled back just enough to look at his face. Her eyes were dry. "And I left Mr. Buttons on the road, like breadcrumbs. Did Briggs find him?" Briggs crossed the space and produced the one-eyed bear, slightly road-worn and carrying the dust of Highway 880 on his matted fur. Wren reached out both hands. She held Mr. Buttons against her chest and closed her eyes, and then, only now that it was over, she cried. Not the desperate crying of fear, the releasing kind, the kind that means it is finished, and I held on long enough, and now I can let go. Stellan held her and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. The warehouse door opened. Nora Calloway had not stayed on the perimeter. She had tracked the route on her phone and identified the access point by looking at the Port Authority map on the city's public records website during the drive. She had parked behind Briggs's vehicle, and she had walked through the east entrance, and she had arrived in the circle of the work lamp's light to find her daughter in the arms of a man who was holding her like she was the most important thing in the world. She crossed the warehouse floor to run. She dropped to her knees in front of them, and her hands went to Wren's face, cataloging a mother's inventory of her child taken at close range and high speed. Wren transferred from Stellan's arms to her mother's with the smooth ease of a child accustomed to moving between the two safest places she knew. Nora held her daughter so tightly that Wren made a small sound of protest, and Nora loosened her grip by exactly 1 degree and no more. She looked at Stellan over Wren's shoulder. He was still kneeling on the concrete floor. His hands were at his sides. There was something in his face that she had not seen before, or rather she had seen its component parts separately in fragments over weeks of Sundays. The grief and the determination and the particular quality of care that looked on a man like Stellan Voss almost incongruous. She had seen those things separately. Now they were all present at once, and together they made something that she did not have a word for yet, but recognized. She did not speak. She nodded once slowly, and his jaw tightened, and he nodded back, and the exchange contained everything that needed to be said in that moment and left the rest for later. Grace Voss came home on a Tuesday morning. She was 8 years old. She had been 6 when Isabel's people had come for her in the night. The 2 years between those ages had produced a child almost entirely unrecognizable from the one at their beginning under normal circumstances. Grace had spent those 2 years in controlled environments with limited human contact with books and outdoor time and regular meals, but without any of the things that actually construct a person. She was thin, she startled at sounds, she watched exits, but she was there fundamentally herself in the ways that 2 years of Isabel Crane's custody had not managed to reach. Stubborn and observant and possessed of an interior life that she had maintained by sheer force of will. Stellan was waiting at the door when Carver's car pulled in. He watched Grace walk toward him across the gravel drive with the slightly careful gait of a child who has learned that environments change without warning. She stopped 3 feet in front of him. She looked at his face for a long moment. Then she walked forward the remaining 3 feet and put her arms around his waist, and Stellan Voss bent over his daughter and held her with both arms and both hands and every remaining degree of himself, and the house that had been a memorial for 2 years became something else entirely in the span of a single embrace. "I'm home," Grace said into his coat. "You're home," he said. "You're never leaving again. You're thinner. You're taller. I had to measure myself on the wall. They wouldn't let me use a real ruler." She pulled back and looked at him with the directness he had missed every single day. "I kept track. I grew 2 3/4 inches. I'll get you a proper ruler. And I want pancakes. I'll make pancakes. You don't know how to make pancakes. I've been practicing." Grace looked at him with an expression that communicated with remarkable economy the distance between his self-assessment and the probable reality. "I'll believe that when I see it," she said. She was healing. Not quickly, not without setbacks. There were nights when Stellan heard her moving through the house at 3 in the morning checking locks. There were days when she did not speak much and watched the windows. He did not try to hurry any of it. He sat with her and answered questions when she asked them and left space when she needed it, and gradually the gap between who she had been before and who she was now began slowly to fill. She was wary of strangers. She was wary of almost everyone in the methodical and self-protective way of a child who had spent 2 years learning that people who appeared safe were frequently not. Until Wren. Nora brought her daughter to the mansion on the first Sunday after the warehouse, the Sunday they would have gone to church. Wren arrived in her best dress, still secondhand, still slightly too large in the shoulders, but clean and pressed with the care that Nora brought to every small thing she could control. She walked through the front door and looked around with the unhurried interest of someone making an honest assessment. Grace was sitting on the couch in the front room, a book open on her lap. Her posture carrying the contained tension of someone who has been informed that visitors are coming and has been quietly dreading it. Wren walked directly to her. Not running, not with the performance of enthusiasm that children sometimes produce for the benefit of watching adults. just walking with the same settled directness that she brought to everything, and stopping in front of Grace with an empty space where Mr. Buttons usually occupied her arm. She had set him down on the entry table to keep both hands free for the introduction. Grace looked at her. Ren looked back. "Hi," Ren said. "I'm Ren. Your dad told me about you." Grace said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the edges of her book. "I know you're scared," Ren said without preamble or softening, because Ren Calloway had learned early that pretending not to see things was a form of dishonesty. "I was scared too when the bad lady took me. I was in that chair for a really long time, and I kept thinking about what I would do when it was over." She paused. "Mr. Stellan came. He always comes. That's what he does." Still nothing from Grace. Ren went back to the entry table and retrieved Mr. Buttons. She sat down on the edge of the couch, maintaining the careful distance of someone who understands that trust is not established by proximity alone. "This is Mr. Buttons." She held up the one-eyed bear. "He only has one eye. But my first dad, before he went to heaven, he used to say that the best seers only need one eye because they know where to look." She set Mr. Buttons on the cushion between them, in the neutral territory between her side of the couch and Grace's. "He can be ours, both of ours, if you want." Grace looked at the bear. It sat between them on the cushion, its remaining eye directed forward, its worn fur carrying the evidence of every difficult place it had been and every hand that had held it for comfort. It had been to a hospital at 4 in the morning. It had been to a warehouse by the water. It had traveled Highway 880 at 55 miles an hour and been found in the cold by a man who understood what it meant. Grace reached out and picked it up. She held it in both hands the way children hold things they are not sure they are allowed to want. She looked at its single eye. She pressed it tentatively against her chest and then more firmly, the grip tightening in the way of someone who has decided. She looked at Ren. For the first time in 2 years, Grace Voss smiled. It was small, cautious, nothing like the uninhibited brightness of the gap-toothed 6-year-old in the silver frame photograph. But it was real and it was hers, and it was directed at a child who had offered the only currency that actually mattered, the simple recognition that healing was allowed to take as long as it needed to take. From the doorway of the room, Stellan and Nora stood side by side and watched their daughters, and neither of them spoke because the moment did not require anything additional from the adults. The federal case moved with the efficiency that attaches to situations where the evidence is overwhelming and the defendant has powerful enemies in multiple jurisdictions who are happy to cooperate with prosecution as a means of eliminating a long-standing problem. Isabel Crane was charged with kidnapping across state lines, conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and the first-degree murder of Owen Calloway. The evidence package that Briggs had assembled over his weeks of investigation, supplemented by Arthur Pell's testimony, and the records recovered from the Montana property, was, the lead prosecutor told the court on the first day of trial, among the most comprehensive she had seen in 20 years of federal practice. Nora Calloway testified on the 4th day. She had been offered the option of a written statement, a remote video appearance, any number of accommodations that would have allowed her to deliver what she needed to deliver without being physically present in the same room as the woman who had ordered her husband's death. She declined all of them. She walked into the courtroom on a Tuesday morning in February, wearing a coat that was not inadequate for the cold and shoes that were not worn, both purchased with the first installment of the civil settlement that Owen's estate had reached with Meridian Solutions, a successor company. She sat in the witness box. She looked at the prosecutor, not at Isabel. She testified for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She spoke about Owen, about who he had been, about the 3 weeks of vague unease that had preceded his death, about the phone call from the police at 7 in the morning, about the 2 years of believing that the world was simply indifferent rather than actively cruel. She spoke about Ren and about the specific ways that a child processes the loss of a parent when no one tells her the truth about how it happened. She did not cry. Her voice did not break. She delivered the 2 hours and 40 minutes of testimony with the controlled precision of a woman who has decided that the most useful thing she can do with her grief is to aim it accurately at the person who caused it. At the end, the prosecutor asked her if there was anything she wished to add. Nora looked at the jury. She thought about Owen, about his voice on the phone the week before he died, saying something feels off. Nora about the way he had kissed her goodbye that last morning, with the particular attentiveness of a man who did not know it was the last morning, but who tried to be present at every one. "My husband was an ordinary man," she said. He wasn't brave in the way that gets remembered. He was brave in the quiet way, the way that just means you do what's right, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's risky, even when you're not sure anyone is watching. She paused. Someone was watching, and they killed him for it. I think the most important thing the court can do is make sure that the next person who does what Owen did understands that the people watching won't always be the dangerous ones. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. The verdict on all counts was unanimous. Isabel Crane received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, used the word premeditated 5 times in a row, which the court reporter noted was unusual and which the courtroom received in complete silence. When the sentence was delivered, Isabel looked across the courtroom toward where Stellan sat. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the front row of the gallery, where Nora sat with her hand over her mouth and her eyes closed, and where Ren and Grace sat beside each other on the same bench, their shoulders touching Mr. Button's, resting on Ren's knee, with his single eye directed calmly forward. In the months that followed the sentencing, Stellan Voss made 3 phone calls that cost him more than money. The first ended his weapons distribution network, a conversation of 11 minutes that dismantled 12 years of infrastructure without drama or ceremony, because Stellan had learned from watching Nora that some of the most important things a person does are done quietly without an audience. The second transferred controlling interest in 2 of his less visible enterprises to a federal asset forfeiture arrangement that he had quietly negotiated before the trial concluded. The third was to Briggs, who listened without comment and then said, "You sure?" Stellan looked at Ren's drawing still pinned to the wall above Grace's nightstand, 2 figures on a cloud holding hands, yellow halo and dark coat. He thought about Grace asking for pancakes before she had even let go of his coat. He thought about Nora's hand pressed flat against the witness stand rail, steady as stone. "I have 2 daughters now," Stellan said. Briggs was quiet for a moment. "Then yeah," he said, "I'm sure too." The week after the sentencing, Stellan called Father Ellard. He asked if he could use the church on Sunday morning before the regular service. Father Ellard said yes, without asking why, which was one of the qualities Stellan had always appreciated in the old minister. He brought Nora and Ren and Grace to St. Andrew's on a morning in late February, when the light came through the high windows at an angle that made the old building look less like something that was falling apart and more like something that had simply been standing long enough to develop its own character. He walked them down the center aisle. Grace held his hand on the right. Ren walked on his left, Mr. Buttons under her arm, her shoes. New shoes, actual children's shoes in the right size with no tape on them, purchased from a store where the price was irrelevant, making small sounds on the worn wooden floor. Nora walked a half step behind, looking at the building with the expression of someone who is seeing a familiar place through different eyes. He stopped at the last pew on the left. "This is where I was sitting," he said, "the first day." Nora looked at the pew. She looked at the space in the shadows where a man had been sitting alone for 2 years, doing penance for a grief he didn't yet know was incomplete. "This is where my life changed," Stellan said. He looked at Ren, where a little girl with taped shoes and a one-eyed bear sat down beside a man who had stopped being a person and reminded him what it felt like to be one. Ren looked up at him. "Mr. Button says you're welcome," she said solemnly. He looked at Nora. Then he went to one knee on the wooden floor. It was not smooth, the boards were uneven, the surface rough from decades of foot traffic. He didn't notice. "Nora Calloway," he said. His voice was even, which required effort. "You walked into this church 2 months after your husband was murdered, and you were trying to hold your world together with both hands, and you didn't ask anyone for anything. You found out what I am, and you made your own decision about whether it mattered. You came to a warehouse with a partial plate number and your own map because you weren't willing to wait for someone else to save your daughter." He reached into his coat pocket. The ring was simple, a single stone, set in plain metal, chosen because it was honest. "I don't deserve you. I don't deserve Ren." He held her gaze. "But I am asking with everything I have for the chance to spend the rest of my life trying to." The church was quiet. Then Ren grabbed her mother's sleeve with both hands and said at a volume that carried comfortably to the back of the empty building, "Say yes, Mommy. He makes pancakes shaped like stars." Beside her, Grace, who had been watching the whole proceedings with the serious attention she brought to everything, nodded once in confirmation with the authority of someone who had personally verified the pancake claim and found it to be accurate. Nora's breath came out in something that was not quite a laugh, but was its close neighbor. She looked at the ring. She looked at the man kneeling in front of her on the uneven floor of a crumbling church in East Oakland, wearing the same dark coat he had worn every Sunday for 2 years, who was at this moment the furthest thing possible from the man described in Fergus Mallory's folder. She looked at Wren. She looked at Grace. She thought about Owen, about the particular way he had of being brave without announcement, about the star-shaped pancakes and the 2 sweaters in October and the 3 weeks of quiet dread before Highway 17. She thought about what he would say if he could say something. She thought he would say, "Be happy, Nor. That's what I wanted for you. That was always the whole point." "Yes," she said. Stellan slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, and she stepped toward him. And when his arms went around her, she felt something that she had almost forgotten was a thing people felt, the specific quality of safety that comes not from the absence of danger, but from the presence of someone who will stand between you and it. Behind them, Wren made a sound of triumphant satisfaction and hugged the air where Mr. Buttons would have been. She had given him to Grace to hold for the occasion because Grace had been nervous about the morning, and Mr. Buttons helped with that. And Grace looked at the ceiling with the expression of a child who is trying to appear dignified but is not entirely succeeding. And Father Ellard emerged from the sacristy with a knowing smile and said simply, "About time," and the old church held all of it in the particular silence it had been accumulating for decades. 1 year later, on a Sunday morning in February, a family of 4 arrived at St. Andrew's Church. They came in through the main door. Stellan carried Grace on his back. She was 9 now, and theoretically too old for this, and demonstrated her maturity by accepting it only until they reached the door, at which point she climbed down and straightened her coat with dignity. Wren walked beside Nora with Mr. Buttons under her arm and her shoes making small, purposeful sounds on the church steps. They moved through the congregation, stopping to exchange greetings, because they were known here now, because 7 weeks of a man sitting alone in the back had been followed by months of something else entirely, and made their way to the last pew on the left. The 4 of them settled in. Grace opened the hymnal to the correct page without being asked, a habit she had developed through the patient repetition of weekly attendance. Wren set Mr. Buttons on her knee, arranging him with the care she always brought to this, his single eye directed at the altar. Nora laced her fingers through Stellan's. Father Ellard began to speak, his voice filling the old building with the unhurried authority of a man who has been saying true things in this room for 30 years. Outside, the February light came through the high windows at the angle that made the stained glass bloom even in winter, sending pale colors across the worn floorboards. The door at the back of the church opened. A man came in alone, older, tired, his coat inadequate for the cold, in the way of someone who has been traveling and did not plan well for the weather. He stood at the entrance, scanning the pews and finding what everyone who walks into a crowded church hopes not to find: every seat already taken. Every seat except the ones in the last pew on the left. He walked down the aisle. He stopped at the end of the pew. He looked at the small family arranged along it. The man, the woman, the 2 girls, the stuffed bear occupying a precise position of dignity between the younger children. "Excuse me," he said quietly enough not to disturb the service. "Is this seat taken?" Wren looked up at him. Her expression was the same one. It had always been direct and unhurried. The expression of a child who sees things clearly and has learned that what she sees is usually worth acknowledging. She looked at the man's tired face, at his insufficient coat, at the particular quality of alone that a person carries when they have been carrying it for a long time. She looked at Stellan. He looked at her. Then she looked back at the man at the end of the pew, and she smiled, the real kind, the immediate kind, the kind that does not perform itself for anyone's benefit, but simply exists because something good is about to happen. "Yes," she said, "but there's always room for one more." She moved Mr. Buttons 3 inches to the right, and the man sat down, and Father Ellard's voice continued to fill the church. And outside, the February morning continued its ordinary business, entirely unaware that in the last pew on the left side of St. Andrew's Church, East Oakland, something that had been broken for 2 years had finished becoming whole.